There is an automobile so fascinating, it has captured the hearts of many.
Feeling free and rolling easy, you got places to be going.
They were loud, wide, and full of soul, cars that roared through our childhood and vanished without warning. What happened to the machines that shaped a generation and then disappeared like they were never real at all? The Chevrolet Vega rolled out with bold dreams. It was meant to be a compact car for a new era, lightweight, efficient, stylish. And it had one headline feature, an aluminum engine that was supposed to revolutionize small car performance. But that engine turned out to be its undoing. It overheated, it warped, it failed. For many drivers, the Vega started as a promise and ended as a cautionary tale. Kids in the back seat might remember the smell of coolant more than the family vacations. Underneath its slick styling, the Vega simply was not built to last. Rust showed up like an uninvited guest. Head gaskets blew out without warning. What was supposed to be GM's forward-thinking marvel became a repair shop regular. Still, if you grew up in the 1970s, chances are you saw plenty of them on the road because they sold fast. Everyone knew someone who had a Vega. Maybe your neighbor, maybe your uncle, maybe your dad. And no matter how badly it ran, it was part of your daily backdrop. Parked at the curb, rattling down the road, or waiting in line at the drive-thru. The Vega was not just a car. It was a flawed dream on four wheels. The Ford Pinto looked innocent enough until it made the evening news. What began as an affordable subcompact car quickly turned into a national controversy. It was small, it was stylish, it was cheap, but under certain crash conditions, it could erupt into flames. The placement of the gas tank turned low-speed rear-end collisions into firestorms. News stories exploded, lawsuits followed, and just like that, the Pinto became a symbol of corporate negligence. But here is the thing. Despite all of it, the Pinto was everywhere. You still saw them outside grocery stores, in high school parking lots, and pulling campers down the highway. They were sold in massive numbers. For kids riding in the back seat with the windows down, the fire risk was not part of the memory. You remember the patterned vinyl seats, the rattle of the hatchback, the smell of the plastic dash baking in the sun. To a generation of families trying to save on gas, the Pinto was a lifeline. To critics, it was a nightmare. And in between, it became one of the most unforgettable cars of the decade, not because it dazzled, but because it dared. The AMC Gremlin was weird and proudly so. It looked like someone took a regular car, chopped off the back, and called it a day. But that oddball design made it unforgettable. The Gremlin was AMC's way of doing compact on their own terms. Short, stubby, and different, it stood out in a sea of look-alike sedans. And kids loved it. It was the kind of car you could draw with a crayon, and everyone would know exactly what it was. The rear window curved sharply. The hatch popped open like a toy box. It came in wild colors with bold graphics, sometimes even stripes. And despite its size, it had personality for days. People bought them because they were cheap and easy to fix, but they kept them because they were fun. You could load up your gear in the back, cram a few friends into the small seats, and hit the road without a plan. It was not sleek. It was not elegant, but it was yours. The Gremlin was the car that let your big brother feel independent, or your parents feel practical. It was awkward in the best possible way, and if you ever rode in one, you never forgot it. The 1970 Cadillac Eldorado was not just a car, it was a statement. It measured over 18 feet long with lines that stretched on like highways themselves. Every inch was dipped in chrome. The front looked like it could bulldoze through time. And the ride? It was smoother than silence. The Eldorado was a front-wheel drive giant powered by a monstrous V8 engine. You did not just sit in it, you sank. Seats were wide enough to sleep on. The doors were so heavy they could bruise your pride. But you felt like royalty every time you closed them. Parking one took confidence. Turning one took patience. But cruising in an Eldorado felt like being untouchable. Kids in the back seat would disappear into its velour depths. Grandparents would whisper, Now this is a car. It was the kind of vehicle you washed by hand, not because it needed it, but because it deserved it. And even though gas prices and practicality would soon shove land yachts off the road, the Eldorado left a permanent impression. It was big, it was bold, and it was absolutely unforgettable. The Pontiac Trans Am was pure attitude. It was the car you drew on your notebook during math class. It was the car that made you dream of open roads, mirrored sunglasses, and Burt Reynolds behind the wheel. Thanks to Smokey and the Bandit, the Trans Am became more than a muscle car. It became a pop culture legend. That screaming Firebird decal on the hood? Iconic. The T-top roof? Cooler than any convertible. And the engine under that shaker scoop was not just for show, it meant business. The Trans Am was loud, it was fast, and it had flair. Teenagers idolized it, adults respected it, and even people who never owned one still remember what it sounded like when it flew past on a summer night. It captured everything the 1970s stood for: freedom, rebellion, and just the right amount of recklessness. You did not drive a Trans Am quietly. You roared through the world and made sure it looked. The car might be parked today, but the feeling it gave you never left. The Dodge Tradesman. Van was not just a van, it was a canvas. It rolled off the lot as a blank box, and what happened next was entirely up to you. Shag carpet interiors, crushed velvet, bubble windows, diamond-shaped portholes, beds in the back, wood-paneled walls, lava lamps bolted to the ceiling. It was a van, sure, but it was also a den, a clubhouse, a moving apartment on wheels. This was the height of custom van culture in the 1970s. You painted flames on the sides, or wizards, or half-naked warriors fighting dragons. You parked it at the beach and opened the doors to let in the music. Teenagers saw freedom. Adults saw headaches. But either way, the Tradesman became a symbol of expression and rebellion. No two were alike. Some had 8 tracks, CB radios, and tiny refrigerators. Some had blackout curtains for privacy or mystery. You might not remember where you were going, but you remembered how it felt to ride in one. It was soft, loud, and a little bit dangerous. The Tradesman van was a fortress of personality built by its driver, shaped by its passengers. And whether it was parked in a lot or flying down the freeway, it always drew eyes. You didn't just drive it, you lived in it. The Chevrolet Chevelle SS 454 was a monster hiding in plain sight. It looked like a mid-sized coupe, maybe something your neighbor would drive to work. But under the hood, it was anything but tame. With a massive 454 cubic inch V8 engine, it delivered the kind of power that turned green lights into launch pads. It rumbled, it growled, it roared. The SS badge was not just for show, it meant business. And in the 1970s, nothing said teenage rebellion like driving a car that could outrun nearly anything on the road. This was the kind of car your parents warned you about. It left black streaks on pavement and made your heart race just sitting at idle. The hood bulge, the stripes, the deep bucket seats, it all screamed speed. And even if you never had one, you dreamed about it. You had posters on the wall. You watched it tear up streets in movies. It was muscle in its purest form, the kind of car that made your foot heavy and your pulse quick. But the world was changing. Regulations crept in, insurance rates soared, and cars like the SS 454 began to disappear. Still, the legend lived on. And for anyone who was lucky enough to ride in one, that memory never left. The Ford Country Squire Woody wagon was the family car that felt like a rolling vacation home. With its long body, fake wood paneling, and third-row bench that faced backwards, it was more than just transportation, it was an experience. You did not just drive it. You packed it full of cousins, coolers, folding chairs, and half the garage. It had the kind of cargo space that swallowed everything and still had room left over for the dog. The simulated wood trim made it feel fancy in a way only the 1970s could get away with. And for a lot of families, it was the first car you ever rode in. Maybe even the one you learned to drive in. You remember the click of the seatbelts, the hum of the tires on a long road trip, and how your siblings fought over who got the way back seat. It was the car of summer vacations and grocery hauls. The roof racks were always ready. The rear window rolled down with the turn of a key. It creaked a little, it floated over bumps, and it made every trip feel just a little bit special. The Country Squire was comfort, chaos, and childhood all rolled into one. It was the unofficial station wagon of America. And if you grew up in the 1970s, chances are you rode in one, napped in one, or threw up in one. The Volkswagen Super Beetle was small, but its presence was huge. You could spot it from a block away with its unmistakable round shape, bug-eyed headlights, and humming engine that sounded like nothing else. This was not just a car. It was a movement. Kids decorated them with peace signs, daisy stickers, and rainbow paint. Hippies loved them. College kids trusted them, and parents bought them because they just kept going. The Super Beetle was a little more refined than its earlier cousins. Longer front end, upgraded suspension, more space inside. But it still had the same charm. The clunky engine in the rear, the flimsy heat that never worked right, the glove compartment that always squeaked, and somehow that just made you love it more. You learned to drive stick in one. You fit 5 friends into one and still had room for a guitar. It was easy to fix, easy to park, and impossible to hate. It was not fast. It was not flashy, but it was faithful. The Super Beetle was the underdog you rooted for. It kept going when others broke down. And if you grew up in the 1970s, it probably carried your first memories of freedom, laughter, and long winding roads. The original Honda Civic showed up quietly, but it changed everything. Small, boxy, and strangely charming, it was Japan's answer to rising gas prices and bulky American land yachts. It did not roar. It buzzed. But that buzz became the soundtrack of a new kind of driver. The Civic was cheap to buy, cheap to fill, and cheap to fix, and that made it a revelation. For teenagers, it was the first taste of independence. For families, it was the backup car that always seemed to run. It was not glamorous. It did not come with wood paneling or shag carpet, but it had personality. The seats were thin, the air conditioning was weak, but it got the job done. And more than that, it started a revolution. This was the beginning of the import wave. People realized they did not need something big to go far, and the Civic proved it. It darted through traffic. It laughed at gas stations. It made you think twice about what a car could be. You probably knew someone who had one, and if you were lucky, you were the one behind the wheel. The Buick Riviera boat tail was a head-turner, whether you loved it or hated it. With its sweeping rear window and dramatic tapered tail, it looked more like a custom show car than something you could buy at a dealership. It was long. It was low. It was unmistakably bold. The design was inspired by classic speedboats and 1930s-era fastbacks, and it gave the Riviera a personality no one else dared to match. It was not trying to fit in. It was trying to make you stare. People paused at stoplights just to process what they were looking at. Some called it genius. Others called it a design disaster. But nobody ignored it. Under the hood, it packed a V8 that moved all that steel with surprising urgency. Inside, it was pure 1970s opulence, plush seats, dramatic curves, and a dashboard that wrapped around you like a cockpit. The boat tail was only made for a few short years, and that rarity only added to its legend. It was not a compromise car. It was a statement car, and whether it sat in your driveway or your dreams, it left an impression that stuck. The Oldsmobile Cutlass Supreme was the car that made you feel like you made it, even if you still lived paycheck to paycheck. It had style, reliability, and just enough flair to feel upscale without being out of reach. Your uncle probably had one. Your dad definitely talked about one. Your neighbor waxed his every Saturday. This was the car of the working class with a touch of class. The Supreme trim gave you soft seats, chrome trim, and a vinyl top that made it feel like a personal luxury coupe. And it rode like butter, smooth, quiet, confident. It was the kind of car you took to weddings, to graduation, or just to the grocery store, but you always looked good doing it. It was not flashy like a Corvette or wild like a Trans Am, but it had presence. You respected the person who drove a Cutlass. They made smart choices. And under the hood, It had enough muscle to surprise you at a stoplight. For years, it was one of the best-selling cars in America. And when you saw one parked at the curb, you knew the owner had good taste. The Cutlass Supreme was steady, stylish, and always dependable. The Chevrolet Caprice Classic was everywhere, and for good reason. It was big, boxy, and built like a brick wall. You saw it on police chases in every television show. You saw it outside the grocery store. You saw it in your own driveway. It was a car that served everyone, from cops to cabbies to proud suburban dads. The Caprice had room for 6, a trunk big enough for 2 weeks of groceries, and a ride so soft it could put you to sleep. But it was not just a cruiser. It had power under the hood and presence on the street. The squared-off lines, stacked headlights, and full chrome bumpers made it look like it was cut from stone. And the sound of its V8 rumble? You could hear it coming down the block. It was a family car, yes, but it had muscle in its bones. Kids rode in the back without seatbelts, bouncing over potholes like it was nothing. Moms drove it to school drop-off. Dads used it for long commutes. And somehow, it never quit. The Caprice Classic was not glamorous, but it was unforgettable. And if you ever rode in one, you remember the way the door shut with a deep, solid thunk. The Datsun 240Z was the first time a lot of Americans realized Japan could build a real sports car. Sleek, low-slung, and surprisingly affordable, it looked like it belonged in Europe, but it cost a fraction of the price. That was the magic. It gave you the styling of a Ferrari, the reliability of a Datsun, and a driving experience that punched way above its weight. It had a straight-six engine, rear-wheel drive, and a gearbox that made you feel like a hero with every shift. And the best part? It actually worked. No electrical gremlins, no leaky carbs, just clean, confident power in a lightweight body. You could carve corners in it, you could drive it to work, you could take it on road trips, and you always got a second look at the gas station. The 240Z sold like crazy because it delivered on everything it promised. For a generation that was growing tired of bulky American coupes, it was a breath of fresh air. The import wave had arrived, and it was wearing a Datsun badge. The Plymouth Duster was the car that yelled before it moved. Bright colors, loud decals, bold stripes. You could spot one from 3 blocks away. It was affordable muscle for people who wanted speed and attitude without the insurance nightmare, and it delivered. The Duster came in wild shades like sassy grass green and Moulin Rouge. It had blackout hoods, fat tires, and even a performance version called the 340 that could give bigger cars a serious scare. It was a factory hot rod with a price tag that teenagers could almost reach if they worked a summer job or begged their parents hard enough. Inside, it was simple. Vinyl seats, a few gauges, and not much else. But when you fired it up, it came alive. It felt like it wanted to run wild the second you turned the key. Teenagers loved it. Parents barely tolerated it. And mechanics knew it would always come back for more. It was the kind of car you saved up for one summer, then drove into the ground the next. You added stickers, swapped the wheels, revved it at stoplights just to feel important. But every second behind the wheel felt like yours. The Duster was not refined, and it did not pretend to be. It was raw, loud, and completely unapologetic. It was for people who liked the fast lane, even if they lived in the slow part of town. The Lincoln Continental with suicide doors was not just a car, it was an event. Long, low, and heavy as a vault, it looked like it belonged in a presidential motorcade even if it was parked in your neighbor's driveway. Those rear hinge doors were the centerpiece, swinging open like gates to something more dignified. When they opened in opposite directions, stepping in felt like entering a boardroom or a ballroom. The chrome was thick, the ride was silent, and the seats were more like armchairs than anything else. Every inch of it whispered power. It was smooth, it was slow, and it was proud. Grandparents drove them to church, businessmen pulled up to hotels in them, and kids just watched in awe. You did not run errands in a Continental. You made an entrance. The suicide doors were risky, sure, but back then they felt regal, like you were driving history. And in some ways you were. Presidents rode in these. Movie stars posed beside them. And for a short time, regular people got to live that fantasy too. It was the same car that carried presidents and movie stars, only this time it carried your family to dinner. It smelled like leather and expensive aftershave. It hummed over the road like a distant memory. Even if you never owned one, you remember seeing one. Long, sleek, and stately as it glided past, it made everything else look like an afterthought. It was not just a luxury car, it was American royalty on wheels. The Chevrolet Monte Carlo was where muscle met manners. It had a big engine under the hood, but inside, it was all velvet, vinyl, and class. You could stomp the gas and hear that V8 growl, or just lean back and glide, letting the plush seats do all the talking. The Monte Carlo was for people who wanted a little bit of everything. It had just enough flash to turn heads, but not so much that it felt like you were trying too hard. The long hood gave it drama. The swooped rear made it sleek, and the padded roof gave it just enough softness to feel expensive. This was the car you took on dates, but also the one your uncle drove to work. It was muscle car energy dressed up in a sport coat. You remember the sound of the turn signal clicking in slow traffic, the way the dashboard glowed at night, the scent of the upholstery, half cologne, half motor oil. And that steering wheel? It felt like it belonged in a lounge, not a car. The Monte Carlo was about balance. It let you have power without sacrificing style. You could take it to prom and the drag strip in the same weekend. And if you were lucky enough to ride in one, you know what it meant to feel cool without saying a word. It was muscle with manners, swagger with silence. It was not loud. It did not need to be. And it was not just the look or the power. It was the whole experience. The Monte Carlo had a way of making you feel like you belonged somewhere better. The way the door shut with a deep, confident thud. The chrome mirror you adjusted not for safety, but because it felt cool to do it. The vinyl top that baked under the summer sun until it smelled like warm leather and nostalgia. You slid across the bench seat, flipped the key, and suddenly the world got quieter, except for the low rumble waiting under the hood. Even the radio felt more important in a Monte Carlo. You did not just play music, you scored your life. Even today, when you see one, faded, rusted, parked behind a chain-link fence, it still has presence. Because some cars never lose their cool. They just wait for you to remember who you were when you drove them. The AMC Pacer looked like a jelly bean on wheels, and somehow that worked. Round, wide, and oddly futuristic, it had more glass than metal and looked like it was designed in a dream. People laughed at it at first, but they never forgot it. The Pacer was AMC's bold swing at compact innovation, and while it might not have hit a home run, it definitely got on base. The wide-body design made it feel bigger than it was, and that fishbowl cabin gave passengers panoramic views of the world. Kids loved it. Adults raised eyebrows. But it always sparked conversation. The doors were heavy, the visibility was unmatched, and the back seat was cozier than it had any right to be. It came in funky colors and sometimes even had plaid interiors. It was weird, but it wore that weirdness with pride. No other car looked like it. None dared to try. The Pacer was AMC saying, "We do not care what Detroit thinks." And in doing so, they gave us something totally original. You might not want to drive one today, but you definitely remember it. The Ford Maverick was built for drivers who wanted style without the price tag. It was Ford's answer to changing times, tight budgets, rising fuel costs, and a new generation of buyers. But even on a dime, the Maverick had attitude. It borrowed some of the muscle car swagger without the muscle car insurance. Sleek body lines, fastback styling, and bright paint options made it feel like a lot more than it cost. Teenagers loved it, young families trusted it, and gearheads found ways to soup it up into something fierce. The Maverick had that starter car energy, but it never felt cheap. It felt like yours. You threw your bags in the back, cranked up the AM radio, and went wherever the road felt good. It was a car that made the most of what it had. Simple, sturdy, and surprisingly stylish. Even if you moved on from it later, the Maverick was your beginning. And beginnings matter. The Chrysler Cordoba was the definition of 1970s indulgence. It was not just a car, it was an ad campaign seared into your memory. Ricardo Montalban's smooth voice called it rich Corinthian leather, and suddenly the Cordoba sounded like it belonged in a mansion. But it was more than a commercial. The Cordoba was Chrysler's pitch to buyers who wanted luxury without the price tag of a Cadillac or Lincoln. It had thick seats, soft carpets, and a ride that floated over every pothole like it was nothing. The styling was bold, sharp nose, dramatic curves, and enough chrome to catch the sun from any angle. It was mid-sized, but it felt full-sized inside. People who drove it felt proud, even fancy. You remember the way it looked parked in the driveway. You remember how quiet it was on the highway. And even if you never sat in one, you definitely heard the phrase Corinthian leather more times than you could count. The Cordoba was comfort sold with a flourish, and it worked. The Jeep Wagoneer was the SUV before we even knew what that meant. It was rugged enough to crawl through the woods, but polished enough to pull up to a country club. With four-wheel drive, boxy charm, and a touch of chrome, it felt like the best of both worlds. You could tow a boat, camp under the stars, and still ride in comfort. Leather seats, air conditioning, wood grain panels that looked more cabin than car. This was the vehicle for dads in flannel who read Field and Stream, and moms who just wanted the groceries to stay upright. The Wagoneer did not shout for attention, it quietly owned it. And it did it without needing to change much. Year after year, it kept the same basic shape, the same sturdy stance. Because when something works, you do not mess with it. Kids grew up in the back seat with thermoses, seatback organizers, and the scent of pine needles baked into the carpet. And when you saw one on the road, you knew the family inside was going somewhere interesting. Maybe the lake, maybe the mountains, maybe just the good life. The Jeep Wagoneer was more than a vehicle. It was a lifestyle, decades before we even used that word. The Pontiac Grand Prix was a personal luxury coupe that knew exactly what it was doing. With its long hood, short rear deck, and endless dashboard wood grain, it looked like it belonged to someone with somewhere important to be. It had the size of a muscle car and the attitude of a cigar lounge. You stepped into it, not just got in. Bucket seats cradled you like a favorite chair. The steering wheel was thick. The dash seemed to stretch out forever, and every dial, switch, and light felt like it had been arranged with care. This was not a car you tossed around corners. You pointed it. You glided. You arrived. It came with powerful V8 options, but the focus was always on smoothness and style. You might remember seeing your uncle polish his Grand Prix on a Saturday afternoon, chrome gleaming in the driveway, or hearing the thump of the door shutting like the punctuation mark on a good sentence. It was personal. It was confident. It was the car for people who knew what they liked and did not need to prove it. The Grand Prix was not about flash. It was about feel. The Chevrolet El Camino was half pickup, half car, and all swagger. It confused people at first. Was it a truck? Was it a coupe? The answer was always yes. And in the 1970s, that was enough to make it cool. You had the front end of a Chevelle and a flatbed in the back, perfect for hauling mulch, surfboards, or your buddy's broken-down lawnmower. But what really set it apart was how easily it lived two lives. On Monday, it carried lumber. On Saturday night, it cruised the strip under neon lights. It was practical without being boring, loud without being obnoxious, stylish without trying too hard. The El Camino looked just as at home parked next to a Camaro as it did outside a hardware store. You could drop in a V8, throw on some Kragar wheels, and suddenly it had street cred. And it was not just for gearheads. Your neighbor, your cousin, even your high school shop teacher might have driven one. The inside? Pure classic. Bench seats, chrome trim, and that satisfying rattle of the shifter. Maybe there were tools behind the seat. Maybe there was a cowboy hat on the dash. It was a car that told stories just by showing up. You might not have been able to afford a Corvette, but the El Camino let you pretend. It was a mullet in vehicle form, business up front, party in the back, and if you ever drove one, you know just how many heads turned when you rolled up. It was weird, it was wonderful, and it could only have come from the 1970s. The Mercury Cougar XR7 was the kind of car that wore cologne. It looked like muscle but felt like velvet. With its hidden headlights, flowing lines, and refined interior, it stood apart from the louder, brasher pony cars of the time. The XR7 trim meant leather seats, faux wood dash panels, and a level of quiet confidence that other muscle cars lacked. The kind of confidence that came with knowing you looked good without needing to shout. This was a gentleman's ride, but it still packed heat. Under the hood, you could find serious V8 options that could smoke tires without breaking a sweat. It was performance with polish. But inside, you had a clock, not just a tachometer. You had softness where others had noise. A lot of muscle cars made you feel hyped. The Cougar made you feel important. It was the kind of car you cruised in, not raced. You put your arm on the window, turned up the FM radio, and watched the world roll by. You might have worn loafers instead of sneakers. You might have combed your hair before picking up a date. The Cougar XR7 was for those who appreciated power, but preferred it to come wrapped in suede and smooth jazz. It was perfect for dates, for downtown, for showing up without showing off. The Cougar XR7 was elegance in a decade that loved excess. It had style, but never shouted, and that is what made it unforgettable. The rise of T-tops was one of the coolest things to happen to cars in the 1970s. Not quite a convertible, not quite a hardtop, just the right mix of freedom and structure. You could pop the roof panels off, stash them in the trunk, and suddenly the wind was in your hair and the sun was on your face. It turned a simple drive into something cinematic. Camaros had them, Firebirds had them. So did Corvettes, 280ZXs, and even the odd Monte Carlo. And when you saw one with the tops off on a summer day, you wanted to be in it. It was a feature that made every teen lean a little closer to the showroom glass. T-tops turned regular cars into weekend adventures. They gave you that cool older cousin energy before you even earned it. And sure, they leaked and rattled, and sometimes they were a pain to put back on when the rain showed up early. But none of that mattered when you were cruising with the top off and your favorite song on the radio. You were not just driving, you were making a statement. That you were cool, that you were free, that you knew how to live a little. You waved at strangers, you smiled more. T-tops were not practical, and that was the point. They made driving feel like an experience, not just a task. And for a while, they were the crown jewel of every kid's dream ride. The Plymouth Volare came in with high hopes and bold promises. Meant to replace the beloved Valiant, it was Chrysler's answer to changing fuel economies and modern styling demands of the mid-1970s. On paper, it looked like a step forward. It had a boxy, confident shape with a comfortable interior and plenty of trim options. For families wanting a solid, affordable ride with just a hint of flair, the Volare seemed perfect. It even won Motor Trend's Car of the Year in its debut. But under that promise, problems were waiting. Rust became a major issue. The suspension was clunky, reliability dropped fast, and recalls started stacking up. What was supposed to be Chrysler's new star faded before the decade even ended. Yet if you grew up in the 1970s, chances are you rode in one. Maybe it was the carpool ride to school or the wagon used on summer road trips. The Volare tried hard to keep up with the times, but the times moved faster. Still, its short-lived fame made it unforgettable for those who lived it. A memory boxed in steel and chrome, long gone but never fully erased. The 1971 AMC Javelin AMX was America's underdog muscle car, and it fought hard to earn its place in the pack. While the Big Three dominated the spotlight, AMC carved out a space with grit, clever design, and genuine performance. The Javelin AMX looked unlike anything else on the road: long hood, short deck, and aggressive lines that hinted at speed even at a standstill. Underneath that bold exterior was serious hardware. With the right setup, it came with a 401 cubic inch V8 that pushed over 300 horsepower. The Javelin was not just about power, though. It had a racing pedigree. AMC took it to NASCAR, and it won championships. That connection gave the AMX a street cred few others could match. Inside, it felt like a proper driver's car: tight, focused, and surprisingly refined. But what made the AMX special was not just the numbers, it was the attitude. It had something to prove, and it did, over and over. Today, it is one of those forgotten heroes of the muscle car era. Not as flashy, not as famous, but for those who know, it holds a special kind of respect. It was the car that punched above its weight and left a dent in muscle car history. The Ford Maverick Grabber was not quite a muscle car, but it sure wanted to be. With its bold decals, spoiler, and optional V8 engine, the Grabber trim of the Maverick aimed squarely at young drivers hungry for speed and style on a budget. Introduced in the early 1970s, it captured a moment in time when flash still mattered and performance was a mindset, even if the horsepower did not quite measure up. Its aggressive looks gave it personality. The compact size made it easy to handle, and it came in colors loud enough to be heard before it even started. The Grabber let you dream a little bigger, even if you were driving something small. But like many cars of its era, it was caught between a changing culture and tighter regulations. Gas prices climbed, emissions rules tightened, and what once felt cool started to feel impractical. By the end of the decade, the Grabber faded out. But for those who drove one, or wanted to, it remains a symbol of rebellion in a shrinking world. A reminder that sometimes attitude is everything. The 1970 Oldsmobile 442 W30 was a muscle car for people who knew exactly what they wanted. It was not flashy like some of its competitors. It did not have wild graphics or over-the-top styling. What it had was performance, pure, deliberate performance. The W30 package meant a Ram Air hood, fiberglass scoops, high-output camshaft, and serious internal upgrades. Under the hood sat a 455 cubic inch V8 that churned out brutal torque and ran hard through every gear. This was a street fighter in a suit. It looked mature, but underneath it was itching for a race. The 442 was all about balance. Power, sure, but also control. The suspension was tight. The brakes were solid. It felt like a full package, not just an engine with doors. And the W30 took all of that to the next level. Today, it is one of the most respected names in the muscle car world, not because it shouted the loudest, but because it delivered, day in, day out. For those who knew, it was the one to beat, and for those who drove one, it was never forgotten. The Chevrolet Monza. 2+2 was a fastback with dreams bigger than its time allowed. Inspired by the sleek shapes of the Corvette, it carried curvy lines, low-profile styling, and the promise of performance. And with an optional V8 under the hood, it could deliver. For a brief moment, it looked like Chevrolet had found a sweet spot between compact practicality and sports car thrill. But then, the reality of the era hit hard. Smog regulations choked performance, safety demands weighed it down, and the same V8 that once excited buyers began to feel sluggish under pressure. Still, the Monza 2+2 had a style all its own. It turned heads with its dramatic angles and offered something that felt different from the boxier compacts around it. Car lovers remember the feeling of sitting low to the ground, looking out over that long, sloping hood. The car whispered rebellion, even if the engine could only manage a mutter. It did not last long, but the Monza 2+2 remains a symbol of ambition. What happens when big ideas meet hard limitations? And sometimes, even half-speed dreams are worth remembering. The 1971 Dodge Charger Super Bee was not built for subtlety. It was built to roar. With its aggressive stance, bold graphics, and unmistakable bulging hood, this muscle car was a rolling declaration of speed and attitude. It wore its name proudly, and for good reason. Under the hood, drivers could choose from a range of powerhouse engines, including the legendary 426 Hemi and the 446 pack, both capable of turning a straight road into a thrill ride. The styling was pure drama: twin-scooped hoods, eye-searing color options, and side stripes that made it look fast even when parked. Inside, it was all business, with rally gauges, bucket seats, and a driver-focused layout that made you feel like a street racer even on a grocery run. Though it only lasted 1 year in the Charger body, The 1971 Super Bee still stands as a snapshot of the muscle car era at full throttle. It was loud, flashy, and unapologetically wild, a car that never asked for attention but always got it. Decades later, when one passes by, people still stop and stare, drawn to its raw energy and rebellious spirit. The Super Bee never faded. It just kept buzzing. The 1970 Dodge Challenger RT was built to make a statement, and it did so with every inch of its wide, aggressive stance. It was long, low, and mean. The kind of car that filled up a parking space like it owned the whole lot. What made the RT special was not just the way it looked, it was the way it moved. With an optional 4406 pack under the hood, this car packed serious heat. That setup meant three two-barrel carburetors working together to turn fuel into fury. And the result? Tire-melting acceleration and a deep rolling thunder that echoed down the block. The Challenger offered more than just straight-line speed, though. Inside, it was plush and roomy, with options galore: bucket seats, rally gauges, a pistol grip shifter. It felt like luxury until you floored it. Then it felt like war. In high school parking lots, this was the dream car. Posters on walls, drawings in notebooks. A Challenger RT meant you were somebody. Even now, decades later, that feeling has not faded. If anything, it has grown, because they do not make muscle like this anymore. They just do not. The Pontiac Ventura Sprint was a quiet sibling in a family of loud legends. While the GTO stole headlines, the Ventura Sprint offered a more affordable, down-to-earth thrill. With sporty stripes, chrome accents, and bucket seats, it looked fast even when parked. It shared its bones with the Chevrolet Nova, but wore Pontiac's badge with pride. Young drivers who wanted flash without breaking the bank saw something special in the Sprint. It came with a range of engines, including a V8 that gave it real bite. It was not a muscle car by name, but it carried muscle in its attitude. For a few short years, it became a familiar sight in suburban driveways and high school lots. But as the 1970s moved on, the Sprint got squeezed out. Insurance hikes, gas prices, and stricter emissions rules dulled its shine. By the end of the decade, it was gone. Yet for those who had one, it was more than a stepping stone. It was a memory on four wheels. The Ventura Sprint may never have roared like the GTO, but it never tried to. It had its own rhythm. And sometimes, quiet confidence leaves the deepest impression. The 1972 Chevrolet Camaro Z28 was the muscle car that refused to bow down, even as the world around it started to change. The second-generation Camaro brought sleeker lines, a longer body, and a lower profile, but the heart of the Z28 was still all about power. Under the hood lived a high-revving 350 cubic-inch V8, pushing performance that thrilled both on the street and the strip. It was a car that looked more grown up, but still picked fights like it was 17. The front split bumper gave it a snarling face, and the cowl induction hood let everyone know it was not here to play games. The suspension was tight, and the handling was better than most expected from a muscle car. Inside, it was stripped down and focused, a space designed for driving, not lounging. And while emissions regulations were creeping in, the Z28 still found a way to deliver. It may not have shouted as loud as the earlier models, but it whispered confidence. Today, the 72 Z28 is often overlooked, but true enthusiasts remember it as the Camaro that carried the muscle torch just a little farther into the future. The Plymouth Roadrunner started as a beast and ended as a cruiser. In its glory days, it was raw muscle, loud, fast, and stripped of nonsense. It came with a horn that made a cartoon sound and performance that could burn rubber at a stoplight. By the mid-1970s, though, the world had changed. Fuel costs were high, insurance was brutal, and regulators were cracking down. So Plymouth tried to adapt. The Roadrunner became heavier, quieter, and more civilized. The decals remained. The name stuck. But the growl turned into a hum. Some fans felt betrayed. Others accepted the compromise. Because even a softer Roadrunner still had attitude. It still looked good parked at the curb. It still made you feel a little cooler with your arm out the window. And if you squinted just right, you could still see echoes of its wilder past. It was a car that evolved. Some say too much, others say not enough. But either way, it survived when others disappeared. It was a symbol of the muscle era's last gasp, a survivor of a time when speed and sound were king, and while it may not have ended with a roar, it still rolled on, carrying memories of what once was. The 1971 Plymouth Roadrunner with the 446-barrel setup was a cartoon come to life, with claws. Everyone remembers the beep-beep horn, the playful badging, and the Looney Tunes reference. But behind the laughs was a serious machine that packed a punch. With a trio of two-barrel carburetors feeding the massive 440 cubic inch V8, this version of the Roadrunner had the kind of instant, pavement-tearing power that made your stomach drop. It was bare bones, loud, and proud. Everything about it screamed fun, but the kind of fun that left rubber burned into the road. The styling was sharp for '71, new body lines, a menacing grille, and that unmistakable air grabber hood. Inside, it was Spartan because luxury was not the point. This car was about sound, speed, and simplicity. It had a joy to it, like it wanted to be driven hard and rewarded those who did. The Roadrunner was the muscle car that did not take itself too seriously, and that is why people loved it. Today, it is remembered as a car that brought a grin to your face and a growl to your ears, delivering horsepower with humor. The Mercury Bobcat was a dressed-up Ford Pinto, but that did not mean it lacked personality. With added chrome, upgraded interiors, and even fake wood grain paneling, the Bobcat tried to bring a touch of class to the compact market. It came at a time when drivers were downsizing, looking for fuel efficiency and affordability. And the Bobcat fit the bill. It was cheap to run, easy to park, and had enough style to avoid looking bare bones. Sure, it carried the Pinto's baggage, particularly the safety reputation, but the Bobcat tried to rise above it with charm. For some, it worked. You would see them lined up at grocery stores, parked outside starter homes, or zipping through city streets. It was not fast, but it was familiar. It was not flashy, but it was friendly. And in its quiet way, the Bobcat became part of daily American life. It never roared, but it purred. A reminder that even the most modest cars can have character. And looking back, it is hard not to smile at a car that wore its stripes, chrome, and faux luxury with such sincere effort. The Dodge Aspen RT was a car with an identity crisis. On one hand, it wanted to be a muscle sedan, packed with racing stripes, spoilers, and bold colors. On the other hand, it was built during an era where muscle was in decline. Released in the mid-1970s, the Aspen RT looked the part. It had aggressive styling, wide tires, and a V8 under the hood. But new emission standards and rising gas prices dulled its performance. The result was a car that promised thunder, but delivered a growl. Still, it carved out a niche. Families who wanted a sporty-looking ride without breaking the bank saw value in the Aspen. Teenagers loved the flash, and for a while it stood out in a crowd of increasingly tame sedans. But mechanical issues, recalls, and competition from more refined imports chipped away at its appeal. The RT trim disappeared quietly, overshadowed by faster and better-built machines. Yet it remains frozen in time as a brave, if flawed, attempt to keep the muscle dream alive. The Aspen RT was not perfect, but it had heart, and sometimes heart is all a car needs to be remembered. The 1970 Mercury Cougar Eliminator was muscle in a tuxedo. It shared its bones with the Ford Mustang but added a touch of class to the chaos. Longer, smoother, and wrapped in a bit more chrome, the Cougar looked refined, but do not let that fool you. Under the hood, the Eliminator meant business. It came standard with a 428 Cobra Jet V8, and if you dared, you could option it up to the Boss 302. The performance was there, the sound was there, and the looks? Pure attitude with a split front grille and signature hidden headlights that gave it a stealthy stare. The Eliminator package added stripes, spoilers, and a dash of NASCAR spirit, giving this sophisticated ride a proper snarl. Inside, it was plush. Vinyl seats, wood accents, and a clean dash reminded you this was still Mercury. still about comfort and elegance. But hit the gas and the rear tires would sing. This was a car that could cruise quietly down a boulevard 1 minute and blow the doors off a rival the next. The Mercury Cougar Eliminator was proof that you could have power without losing poise, and today it is remembered as the muscle car that wore a suit but never backed down from a fight. The Chevrolet Chevelle. Laguna had two sides. One was a family car, roomy and reliable with smooth lines and a comfortable ride. The other side? A NASCAR contender that raced under the bright lights and roaring crowds. In its early years, the Laguna looked like a practical upgrade to the Chevelle line, but its bold front-end styling and aerodynamic tweaks gave it a secret sporty edge. It was a car that tried to balance performance with practicality, and for a time, it pulled it off. Drivers appreciated the quiet strength of its V8 engine and the smooth handling on the highway. But as regulations tightened and fuel costs rose, its power started to feel excessive. Performance was choked down, the excitement dulled, and eventually the Laguna was absorbed back into the sea of forgettable family sedans. Still, those who had one remember the thrill. It was the family car that secretly wanted to race, the weekday commuter with a weekend soul. And even though it vanished quietly by the end of the decade, the Laguna lives on in garage posters, race photos, and the stories of those who once pushed it to the limit. The 1980 Dodge Aspen and Plymouth Volare were holdovers from the previous decade, and by the 1980s, they were embarrassments. Built on aging platforms and clinging to outdated design, these cars were already struggling when the new decade rolled in. Known for catastrophic rust problems, failing suspensions, and erratic quality control, the Aspen and Volare had earned a bad reputation even before the first 1980 models rolled off the line. Dodge and Plymouth tried to extend their lifespans with cosmetic tweaks, new grills, paint schemes, maybe an optional trim package, but the core problems never went away. Engines sputtered and stalled. Carburetors needed constant adjustment. The interiors, filled with brittle plastics and peeling vinyl, degraded faster than the warranty expired. Road noise was loud, steering was vague, and every mile felt like a negotiation with fate. Meanwhile, Japanese imports were getting better every year, more reliable, more efficient, and far more modern. Buyers could feel how far behind they were just sitting in the driver's seat. Still, Chrysler seemed unwilling to admit defeat. Advertising promised value and tradition, but the truth was hard to hide. Eventually, they had no choice. The Aspen and Volare were quietly retired, two relics of a time the industry wanted to forget. Today, they rarely show up at car shows, auctions, or nostalgia pages, because unlike some failures that inspire affection, these ones just wore out their welcome. The Chevrolet Vega had everything going for it. On paper, it was small, stylish, and exactly what American drivers were starting to want in the early 1970s. Fuel prices were rising, imports were gaining ground, and here came the Vega, ready to prove that Detroit could build a compact car with style. Its long hood, clean lines, and two-door hatchback made it a real head-turner. It even won awards. But the problem started early. The innovative aluminum engine, meant to be lighter and more efficient, had overheating issues that warped the cylinders. The body was prone to rust, especially in snowy or salty climates. Owners who expected longevity were met with disappointment. Still, many people kept driving them. They were cheap, easy to handle, and for a lot of folks, the very first car they ever owned. The Vega may not have held up mechanically, but it left behind a different kind of legacy, one of optimism. It tried to be more than what it was allowed to be, and in its failure, it taught an entire generation about trade-offs, expectations, and the real meaning of brand loyalty. The Vega is gone, but in those who drove it, the memories still idle. The 1970 Ford Torino Cobra was the kind of muscle car that did not need to shout. It waited until your guard was down, then roared to life. At a glance, it looked almost reserved. No wild stripes, no cartoon graphics, just clean, sweeping lines and a low, powerful stance. But the moment you popped the hood, everything changed. Sitting inside was the 429 Cobra Jet, a high-compression V8 that breathed through a shaker scoop and delivered jaw-dropping power. This engine was built for business. It launched the Torino down quarter-mile tracks with a force that caught plenty of rivals by surprise. The suspension was tuned for aggression, the frame was strong, and the rear tires were often left smoking. But what truly made the Torino Cobra special was how it carried that muscle. It was not flashy. It was focused. It had the vibe of a quiet brawler in a tailored suit. Inside, the cabin was wide and comfortable, with just enough muscle car flair to remind you what you were driving. No gimmicks, no nonsense. It was made for serious drivers who wanted big power without the noise of a show car. Today, the Torino Cobra is remembered as one of the great sleepers of its era, a car that looked calm until your right foot woke it up. It was a heavyweight, dressed in silence, a reminder that real power does not need to brag, it just needs to be unleashed. The Ford Pinto will always be controversial, but before the headlines and lawsuits, it was just a cheap, cheerful little car that showed up on every corner in the 1970s. Designed to compete with foreign imports, the Pinto offered simplicity. It was small, affordable, and came in bright colors with a bubble-like shape that somehow made people smile. High schoolers loved it, parents appreciated the price, and for a while, it really was the people's car. But the Pinto's name became tied to something darker. A flawed gas tank design made rear-end collisions dangerous, sometimes fatal. Reports of fires made national news, and lawsuits followed. Ford's decision not to make immediate changes damaged its reputation for decades. Still, not every Pinto exploded. Millions were sold, and many ran just fine, ferrying families to drive-ins, beach trips, and first jobs. It is hard to separate the scandal from the sentiment, but both are part of the story. For better or worse, the Pinto was a symbol of its time. It was the gamble people took on a budget, the dream of mobility at a lower cost, the risk you accepted with every turn of the key. And even now, seeing one in the wild stops you in your tracks, not out of fear, but recognition. The 1985 Yugo GF made headlines as the cheapest new car in America. But cheap came with a price, and the Yugo paid dearly. Built in the former Yugoslavia and imported with bold promises, it was meant to give cost-conscious buyers an entry into car ownership. But almost everything about the Yugo felt like a compromise too far. The engine was noisy, the transmission clunky, and interior trim came loose with the slightest touch. Reviewers described it as toy-like, unstable, and barely roadworthy. On the highway, it struggled to keep up. On hills, it begged for mercy. Repairs were frequent and frustrating, and many new owners regretted the purchase before their first oil change. It became a late-night comedy punchline and the butt of every bad car joke for decades. Some cars fade into obscurity. The Yugo earned infamy. It proved that cutting costs without care leads to one destination: failure. The 1971 Buick GSX Stage 1 was the kind of muscle car that wore a tie to the fight and still knocked you out in the first round. Buick had a reputation for smooth, luxurious rides, cars built for long cruises and quiet comfort. But the GSX flipped that script without tearing it up. Under the hood sat the Stage 1 455 cubic-inch V8, a torque-heavy powerhouse that quietly outperformed some of the loudest names in the game. With well over 500 pound-feet of torque, it could flatten your spine at a stoplight. Yet it did all this without screaming for attention. The GSX came in two standout colors, Saturn Yellow and Apollo White, both with bold racing stripes, rear spoilers, and blacked-out grills. It looked sharp, not showy. Inside, it was all Buick. Soft bucket seats, full instrumentation, and just enough wood trim to remind you that you were not in a stripped-down street racer. But when you dropped the hammer, everything changed. It was fast, refined, and completely intimidating when it needed to be. The GSX Stage 1 did not need gimmicks. It was a high-class assassin on wheels. Today, it is remembered as one of the most underrated muscle cars of the era. It proved that luxury and performance were not opposites, and that a little elegance could still tear up the pavement when the time was right. Sometimes the real threat is the one that stays quiet, until you are already in the rear view. The Buick. Skyhawk did not scream for attention, but maybe that was the point. When it arrived in the mid-1970s, it aimed to blend European inspiration with American sensibility. It was compact, cleanly styled, and powered by a V6 engine that offered decent pep without guzzling fuel. For Buick, a brand long associated with larger sedans and older buyers, the Skyhawk was something different. It targeted the young professional, the first-time buyer, or anyone who wanted a car that felt a little more modern without breaking the bank. It was not flashy, but it was practical. It had sharp lines, bucket seats, and just enough style to stand apart without being loud. But the Skyhawk's quiet charm worked against it in the long run. It never made a big splash, and when new models and designs arrived, it was quickly forgotten. Still, for those who drove one, it represented a turning point. It was the bridge between tradition and modernity, between the wide-bodied beasts of the past and the sleeker designs of the future. It came and went without much noise, but left a soft, memorable echo. The 1984 Ford EXP was supposed to be a sporty two-seater version of the Ford Escort, a compact car reimagined for young drivers looking for flair. But the EXP ended up with none of the performance and even less personality. The engine was weak, especially compared to the Sportier coupes coming out of Japan at the time. The handling was sluggish, the steering vague, and the road feel uninspired. For a car marketed as bold and different, it looked oddly dull. Ford tried hard to pitch it as a fun commuter car, sleek, affordable, and modern. But in reality, it felt more like a lonely Escort missing its back seat. It lacked excitement. It lacked buzz. Even the advertising could not figure out what the EXP was trying to be. Some versions added a turbo, but it was too little, too late. Consumers shrugged, sales tanked, and just a few years later, the model disappeared with barely a whisper. Even among Ford enthusiasts, the EXP has no cult following. The EXP was not a disaster because it did something wrong. It was a disaster because it never did anything right. It promised a thrill and delivered a yawn. If one of these rides took you back, drop a memory in the comments, like the video, and subscribe so the nostalgia keeps rolling.